When I was a teenager, I babysat for a family that lived a few blocks away. They had a big old house with creaky wooden stairs, drafty windows, and a basement that always gave me the creeps. The basement door was at the end of a dim hallway, and every time I walked past it, I felt like someone, or something, was watching me. The kids I watched were sweet and easy to handle, but the house always felt off, especially after dark. One evening, I had just put the kids to bed. I tucked them in, read a story, and made sure their nightlight was on before heading back downstairs. The old clock in the living room struck 10 p.m. as I settled onto the couch with the TV remote. I was just starting to relax when I heard it, a faint, creaking sound, like a door slowly opening. At first, I thought it might be one of the kids getting out of bed, but the sound wasn't coming from upstairs. It was coming from the basement. I muted the TV, holding my breath as I listened. The house seemed to hold its own breath too, the silence almost deafening. Then it came again, louder this time, the unmistakable creak of the basement door, shifting on its hinges. My stomach twisted into knots, and a cold chill ran down my spine. "It's just the house settling," I whispered to myself, trying to sound convincing. But the thought didn't calm me. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, each step landing heavily on the wooden stairs leading up from the basement. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy brass lamp, and stood frozen in the middle of the living room, staring at the basement door. The footsteps continued, one by one, until they stopped, just on the other side of the door. The air in the room felt suffocating, thick with tension. I don't know how long I stood there, gripping the lamp so tightly my knuckles turned white, but eventually I forced myself to move. My legs felt like lead as I walked toward the basement door. My hands were trembling so badly it took me 3 tries to slide the lock into place. The moment the latch clicked, there was a sharp, resounding thud against the door, as if someone had thrown their weight against it. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the lamp. The thudding stopped as suddenly as it started. Panicked, I grabbed my phone and called the parents, barely able to form coherent sentences as I explained what I had heard. They told me to stay put and that they were on their way. Those 15 minutes felt like hours. I sat curled up on the couch, the lamp still in my hands, staring at the basement door. Every creak of the house made me jump. When the parents finally arrived, the dad immediately went to check the basement. He armed himself with a baseball bat from the garage and opened the door slowly. I stayed upstairs with the mom, both of us holding our breath. After a few agonizing minutes, he came back up, his face pale. He held out his hand to show us something. Dirt. His palm was streaked with it, and his shoes left faint muddy prints on the floor. He explained that the small basement window at the back of the house was wide open, the screen pried loose. There were muddy footprints leading from the window to the stairs. Whoever had been down there was gone now, but they had been there, and they had tried to get upstairs. The family called the police and filed a report, but nothing ever came of it. A week later, they packed up and moved out. I never babysat for them again, and to this day, the sound of creaking stairs makes my blood run cold. A few years ago, I lived in a small house with my younger brother. It wasn't anything fancy, just a modest place tucked into a quiet neighborhood. One night, my brother went out with friends, leaving me home alone. I didn't think much of it at the time. I'd been home alone plenty of times before, but that night was different. That night, something happened that I'll never forget. I was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. The house was silent, except for the rhythmic sound of the knife against the cutting board. I remember feeling oddly on edge, though I couldn't explain why. The air felt heavier than usual, like a storm was brewing, even though the weather outside was calm. Then I heard it, a voice calling out from upstairs. "Hey, can you come here for a second?" It was my brother's voice. At first I was just confused. I hadn't heard him come home, and his car wasn't in the driveway when I checked earlier. I set the knife down and wiped my hands on a towel. "Are you back already?" I called out. Silence. No response. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator behind me. I walked to the bottom of the stairs and looked up. The hallway at the top was pitch dark, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow light. My brother's voice came again, clearer this time. "Come upstairs." Something about the tone stopped me cold. It was his voice, but it wasn't right. It was too flat, too emotionless, like someone was imitating him, but didn't quite know how. A chill ran down my spine, and I instinctively stepped back, my hand tightening around the towel. "Is this a joke?" I asked, my voice shaking. Still no answer. The house was so quiet now that I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow. My instincts were screaming at me not to go upstairs. The hallway beyond the staircase felt like a yawning void, something unnatural waiting just beyond the shadows. But I had to be sure. I had to know if I was imagining things, or if something was really there. Grabbing my phone from the counter, I turned on the flashlight and aimed it up the stairs. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the empty hallway. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. My voice echoed faintly, but the house remained silent. Then, as I stood there, frozen in place, the voice came again. "Come upstairs." This time, it was different. It sounded closer, like it was coming from just beyond the top of the stairs. My breath caught in my throat, and my legs felt rooted to the spot. There was no mistaking it now. Something was up there, and it was pretending to be my brother. Panic surged through me. I bolted back to the kitchen and locked the door behind me, my hands trembling so badly I could barely turn the lock. I grabbed the largest knife I could find and stood there, heart pounding, listening. For a few minutes, everything was silent. Then I heard slow, deliberate footsteps coming down the hall above me. They stopped right at the top of the stairs. I stayed in that kitchen, clutching the knife and staring at the door, until my brother finally came home. When he walked in, I nearly collapsed with relief. I told him everything, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. He didn't believe me at first, but the fear in my voice must have convinced him to check the house with me. We searched every room, every closet, every corner, but we didn't find anyone. The windows were locked, and there were no signs of forced entry. Yet, I knew what I had heard. I knew someone, or something, had been there. To this day, I don't know who or what was calling me from upstairs, but every time I think about it, I'm glad I didn't listen. I've always loved hiking. There's something about being in the woods that feels peaceful, like the weight of the world disappears as soon as you step onto a dirt trail. But one trip changed the way I see the wilderness forever. It was late autumn, and I'd decided to tackle a remote trail that few people knew about. I had my backpack, water, and enough supplies to last me the day. The trail was beautiful, winding through dense woods with golden leaves fluttering down like confetti. The first few hours were uneventful, just me and the sound of my boots crunching against the fallen leaves. Around midday, I came across a small clearing with an old wooden bench. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, the wood weathered and grey. I decided to take a break and eat my lunch there. As I sat down, I noticed something odd, a piece of paper wedged between the slats of the bench. Curious, I pulled it out. It was a handwritten note, the ink smeared in places but still legible. It read, "Turn back now, you're not alone." I laughed nervously, assuming it was someone's idea of a joke. But as I looked around, the woods seemed eerily quiet. Too quiet. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. I tried to shake off the unease and continued my hike. About an hour later, I started to feel like I was being watched. Every so often, I'd hear a faint snap of a twig or the crunch of leaves behind me. Each time I stopped to look, there was nothing there, just trees stretching endlessly in every direction. The feeling grew stronger, an oppressive weight on my shoulders that made my skin crawl. As the sun began to set, I knew I needed to head back. The trail was harder to follow in the dim light, and I was starting to panic. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere in the trees behind me. My heart stopped. I froze, listening intently. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush. I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran, my lungs burning and my legs screaming in protest. The footsteps followed me, gaining on me with every step. I could hear whatever it was breathing now, a wet, rasping sound that sent chills down my spine. I didn't dare look back. When I finally burst out of the woods and into the parking lot where my car was parked, the sound stopped. I turned around, gasping for air, but there was nothing there, just the dark outline of the trees, silent and still. I jumped into my car and sped away, not stopping until I was miles down the road. To this day, I don't know what was following me, but I'll never hike that trail again. When my grandmother passed away, my family inherited her old Victorian house. It was a beautiful, sprawling place with creaky wooden floors and a history that stretched back over a century. My parents decided we'd spend the summer there, sorting through her belongings and fixing up the house to sell. The house had a charm to it during the day, with sunlight streaming through the tall windows and illuminating the ornate woodwork. But at night, the place felt different. The shadows seemed darker, the creaks of the floorboards louder. It didn't take long before I started to feel uneasy, like the house was watching me. The attic was the creepiest part. It was filled with dusty old furniture, stacks of yellowed newspapers, and an antique mirror propped against one wall. The mirror was massive, its gilded frame carved into twisting vines and flowers, intricate and oddly lifelike. It was the kind of mirror you'd expect to see in a grand ballroom, not gathering dust in an attic. Yet every time I glanced at it, I felt a chill. It was as if the mirror was waiting for something, or someone. One evening, as the house settled into its unsettling silence, I decided to explore the attic while my parents were downstairs. A sense of dread filled me as I climbed the narrow stairs, but I couldn't stop myself. Something about that mirror seemed to pull at me, even though I didn't want to go near it. The moment I stood in front of it, I felt the air grow colder. My reflection stared back, but there was something off. I tilted my head to the side and my reflection followed, but not quite in sync. When I raised my hand, the reflection hesitated, its movements just a fraction of a second behind mine. My pulse quickened, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the old glass warped the image somehow. Then my reflection smiled, a slow, deliberate grin that spread across its face like oil seeping through water. I hadn't smiled. My own face was frozen in terror, but the figure in the mirror tilted its head, its eyes locking onto mine. "Get out," it whispered, though its lips didn't move. The voice was faint but distinct, as if it had echoed from deep within the glass. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. In my panic, I tripped over a stack of newspapers and fell hard onto the wooden floor. Pain shot through my arm, but I barely noticed. My gaze snapped back to the mirror. My reflection was gone. The mirror now showed only the empty attic behind me, but the air felt heavier, suffocating. I scrambled to my feet and bolted down the stairs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't tell my parents. What could I say? They'd think I was imagining things or trying to scare myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that whatever was in that mirror wasn't finished with me. That night, I dreamt of the attic. In the dream, I was standing in front of the mirror again. But this time, I wasn't alone. My reflection was alive, its movements no longer mimicking mine. It stepped out of the mirror, its icy hand gripping my wrist with unnatural strength. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were black voids that seemed to pull me in. "Come with me," it whispered, its voice like nails scraping against glass. I woke up screaming, my wrist throbbing with pain. Fumbling for the light, I saw red marks on my skin, like I'd been grabbed. My parents came rushing in, but I couldn't bring myself to explain. How could I make them understand the terror I felt? The marks faded by morning, but the fear didn't. The next day, I begged my parents to let me stay with a friend. They thought I was just struggling with the grief of losing my grandmother, but they agreed. I packed my things and left, vowing never to return to that house again. Even now, years later, the mirror haunts my dreams. Sometimes I see the reflection standing there, smiling its eerie, unnatural smile. Sometimes I feel the cold grip of its fingers on my wrist, pulling me back toward the glass. I've learned to sleep with the lights on, but no amount of light can banish the shadows of that house from my mind.